The first binding was for the flesh, the second for the spirit. Ariel drew the linen strip taut across her chest, the familiar pressure a cage her lungs learned to accommodate each morning. In the silvered glass, a stranger stared back, shoulders squared, expression carefully neutral, the living portrait of the heir to the Saxon throne. The person behind the reflection, the one who preferred the weight of a sword to the heft of a crown, was sealed away with every loop of the cloth. Beyond her chambers, the castle stirred with a nervous energy that had become its native state. It had been 3 weeks since the silence fell from the east. 3 weeks since the kingdom of Anat Nigra, their neighbor, ceased all communication. Then the refugees came, hollow-eyed and whispering a name that curdled the blood, the Vandras. They spoke not of armies, but of a silent, creeping unmaking. Fields turned to glass, cities to dust, all without the shout of a single soldier. The fear was a tangible thing now, a mist clinging to the stone corridors. Ariel finished her transformation, shrugging into the tailored doublet of deep blue, the high collar a constant reminder to hold her head a certain way. Her valet, an old man whose loyalty was to the crown rather than the person wearing it, gave a curt nod of approval. The performance was acceptable. Her feet carried her on the well-worn path to the training grounds, the one place where the mask could develop hairline fractures. The crisp morning air smelled of damp earth and forge fire, a welcome assault on her senses after the perfumed stillness of her rooms. And there she was. Charlotte moved through a drill of sword forms, her body a study in focused grace. Sunlight caught the sheen of sweat on her brow, her chestnut hair escaping its practical braid in damp tendrils. She was the only child of no one, a daughter of the kingdom's orphan legion, raised to serve and protect the very structure that had conscripted her. Where Ariel's existence was a performance, Charlotte's was a transaction, service for survival. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. For a fleeting second, the space between them felt charged, a silent conversation passing in the space of a heartbeat. It was the one look that saw past the prince, to the woman. It was the only glance that ever felt like coming home. "Your form is off," Ariel said, her voice lowered into the prince's register. She stepped into the ring, picking up a practice blade. "Your guard drops after a high parry. You leave your right side exposed." A faint smile touched Charlotte's lips. "Then show me." They fell into the familiar dance, the clack of their wooden swords a private language. For Ariel, this was freedom. Here, her body's strength was an asset, not a secret to be bound and hidden. She pushed forward, testing Charlotte's defenses, finding the opening she had described. The tip of her sword tapped gently against Charlotte's ribs. A gasp, soft and sharp, escaped Charlotte. Not from pain, but from the contact. The world narrowed to the space between them, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams around them like gold dust. Charlotte's grey eyes were wide, her breath quick. Ariel's own heart hammered against the constricting linen. Her hand, still holding the practice sword, trembled. She could lean forward. 1 inch. That was all it would take to bridge the gap, to finally answer the question that had hung in the air between them for years. The sound of booted feet on stone shattered the moment. They sprang apart, the spell broken. The king's steward stood at the edge of the training ground, his face grave. "Your presence is required in the council chamber, Your Highness," the man announced, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "Princess Catherine of Drunic has arrived. The alliance is formalized. The betrothal is to be announced at noon." The words struck like lightning. Ariel felt the prince's mask solidify on her face, a cold, rigid thing. She gave a stiff nod, not daring to look back at Charlotte. As she followed the steward, the weight of the doublet felt like lead, the high collar a noose. The performance was over. The trap had been sprung. The walk to the council chamber was a march to the gallows. Every tapestry depicting Saxon's martial history, every suit of armor standing sentinel in the hall, seemed to mock Ariel. They were symbols of a strength she was supposed to embody, yet they felt as hollow as the title she carried. The steward's preceding footsteps were a drumbeat counting down the end of her life as she knew it. The heavy oak doors of the council chamber swung open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and anxiety. King Eleanor stood at the head of the great table, his broad frame rigid with a tension that had become his permanent state. His gaze, when it fell upon her, was not that of a father to a child, but of a strategist assessing a key piece on a board. And beside him were the architects of her cage. King Aram of Drunic was a man carved from worry and granite. His face was lined with the recent terror of Anat Nigra's fate, his eyes darting as if expecting the walls to dissolve at any moment. His wife, the Queen of Drunic, was his opposite. Where he was frayed nerve, she was chilled steel. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze assessing the room, its people, its weaknesses, with a dispassionate calculus. Between them stood Princess Catherine. She was beautiful, in the way a finely wrought sword is beautiful, elegant, purposeful and sharp. Her gown was a somber, rich gray, devoid of the frivolity of peacetime fashion. Her hands were clasped neatly before her, but Ariel saw the faint whiteness of her knuckles. This was not a happy occasion for her either. This was a funeral for her own future, dressed as a wedding. "Ah, my son," Eleanor's voice boomed, a forced heartiness that rang false in the tense room. "Come. Finalize the terms with us. King Aram has been most generous." The word son was a nail hammered into her soul. Ariel took her place, the prince's mask so firmly in place she feared her skin would crack. "The situation admits no delay," King Aram said, his voice rough with urgency. "Anat Nigra is gone. Not conquered, unmade. Our scouts, they report nothing but smoothed stone and silence. Drunic cannot stand alone. Saxit cannot stand alone. This union is the only bulwark we have." "It is more than a marriage," the Queen of Drunic added, her tone cool and precise. "It is a merger. Our armies will integrate. Our supply lines will become one. The Vandras may be a force of nature, but even a storm can be weathered with strong enough walls." Her eyes settled on Ariel. "You will be that wall." The weight of that expectation threatened to crush her. They were not just asking her to marry, they were asking the prince to be a symbol and the woman to disappear forever. Catherine's gaze met Ariel's. There was no malice in it, only a resolute acceptance. "I am prepared to do my duty for the preservation of our people," she said, and the words had the quality of a vow. She was offering her life to this cause. How could Ariel refuse without being a monster of selfishness? The discussion continued, a grim tapestry woven with threads of troop deployments, grain storage, and evacuation protocols. Ariel remained silent, the silent center of the storm. She felt the ghost of Charlotte's gasp still in the air, a fleeting sensation of life compared to the death sentence being formalized around her. Later, on the balcony overlooking the main courtyard, Ariel stood alone, gripping the cold stone railing. The betrothal ceremony was mere hours away. Below, she saw Charlotte, already back at her post, her face a careful blank as she directed the placement of banners for the occasion. She was building the stage for her own heartbreak. A shadow fell beside her. It was Catherine. "They mean to announce it at noon," Catherine said quietly, not looking at her, but out at the preparing courtyard. "I know." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of a kingdom preparing for a fragile hope. "I want you to know," Catherine began, her voice firmer now, "that I do not enter this with any illusion. I know this is a transaction, but I believe in its necessity. I have seen the maps, the reports. I have heard the whispers of what comes for us." She finally turned her head, her eyes searching Ariel's carefully constructed face. "We do not have to be friends, but we must be partners. The lives of everyone in both our kingdoms depend on the strength of this union." It was a plea, a threat, and a confession all in one. She was just as trapped, offering partnership where there could be no love, because the alternative was annihilation. Ariel gave a single, slow nod, the movement feeling mechanical. "For our people," she echoed, the words ash in her mouth. Catherine nodded in return, a look of grim satisfaction on her face, and withdrew. Left alone once more, Ariel looked down at Charlotte. As if feeling the weight of her gaze, the knight in training glanced up. The distance between them was too great to see the exact shade of gray in her eyes, but Ariel felt the connection like a lit ember, a searing pain of love and loss so profound it stole her breath. The bell in the high tower began to toll, marking the 11th hour. 1 hour until the world would officially learn of the betrothal. 1 hour until the door to her own life slammed shut. The 11th bell's echo seemed to vibrate within the very marrow of Ariel's bones. Each toll was a hammer strike on the nail of her fate. The courtyard below had transformed into a theater of grim pageantry, vibrant banners of Saxit and Drunic hanging side by side, a desperate attempt to paint hope over a canvas of dread. She watched the citizens gather, their faces pale with a fear that no amount of colorful silk could truly dispel. They were not here to celebrate, they were here to witness a life raft being constructed. In her chambers, the final layers of the prince's armor were applied. Servants brought forth the ceremonial vestments, a heavy tunic of silver thread, a cloak of Saxit blue lined with ermine, and the slender bejeweled coronet that was the heir's burden. Each item settled upon her with a distinct weight. The linen bindings beneath, once a personal confinement, now felt like the first layer of a funeral shroud. Her valet's hands were efficient, impersonal. "A historic day, Your Highness," the old man murmured, adjusting the drape of the cloak. Ariel said nothing. History was a chain. When the procession formed in the grand hall, she found her place beside her father. King Eleanor's gaze swept over her, a quick, critical inventory. He gave a short, satisfied nod. The product was acceptable for market. Princess Catherine joined them, a vision in Drunic's forest green. Her composure was absolute, a placid lake surface hiding unfathomable depths. She offered Ariel a small formal smile that did not reach her eyes. It was a politician's expression, an acknowledgement of their shared script. The great doors opened. A roar from the crowd outside washed over them, a wave of sound fueled by desperation and a flicker of newfound hope. As they stepped into the blinding sunlight of the main balcony, the sound intensified. Ariel's eyes, against their will, scanned the perimeter. She found her almost immediately. Charlotte was stationed at the base of the balcony stairs, a pillar of stillness in her polished practice armor. Her helmet was off, tucked under her arm, her face a masterclass in neutral duty. But her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were fixed on Ariel with an intensity that felt like a scream in the silent space between them. King Eleanor raised his hands, and the crowd fell into an anticipatory hush. "People of Saxit," his voice carried, a practiced instrument of command. "We stand at a precipice. A shadow has fallen over the world, a terror that consumed our neighbors in Annat Nigra without mercy or reason." A fearful murmur rippled through the masses. He let it hang for a moment before pressing on. "But we are not without hope. Today, we do not surrender to the night. We forge a shield. An alliance of blood and iron with our stalwart neighbors, the kingdom of Drunic." He gestured to King Aram and his queen, who stepped forward with regal nods. "Together, our strength is multiplied. Our resolve is unbreakable." He turned, his expression molding into one of paternal pride, a look that felt like a violation. "And to seal this bond, to ensure a future for all our children, I present my son and heir, who will take the noble Princess Catherine of Drunic as his betrothed." The cheer that erupted was deafening, a cathartic release of collective anxiety. Eleanor beamed, basking in the sound of his own political mastery. King Aram looked relieved, his shoulders slumping slightly. The Queen of Drunic allowed a thin, satisfied smile. Ariel felt Catherine's hand slip into the crook of her arm. The contact was light, formal, yet it burned through the fabric of her sleeve. She forced her own hand to cover Catherine's, a gesture of unity that made her stomach clench. The crowd roared its approval. Her gaze, however, never left Charlotte's. And in that moment, the night's impeccable composure broke. It was not a dramatic shattering, but a subtle, devastating collapse. The color drained from her face. The line of her jaw, usually set with such determination, went slack with a pain so raw it hung in the air between them. She looked as if she had been struck by an unseen blade. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. But it was fractured, and Ariel could see the agony gleaming through the cracks. Charlotte's eyes, which usually held the warmth of a shared secret, were now chips of winter ice. She gave a slow, deliberate blink, and when her eyes opened again, they held nothing but the vacant respect of a soldier for her commander. It was a dismissal, a surrender, a goodbye. "You must wave," Catherine whispered from beside her, her voice low and devoid of emotion, a prompt from one actor to another. Ariel lifted her free hand, a stiff, mechanical gesture, and the crowd's fervor swelled again. She was drowning in their adoration, suffocating under the weight of their hope. The cheers were not for her, they were for the prince, the symbol, the lie. The only person who saw the truth was now the one person from whom she was irrevocably severed. The ceremony concluded. The royals turned to process back into the castle, the adulation of the crowd following them like a tide. As she descended the steps, Ariel passed within feet of Charlotte. The knight did not look at her. She stared straight ahead, at some fixed point on the horizon, her posture so rigid it seemed she might snap. "Your Highness," Charlotte said, her voice flat and formal as they passed. The title, once a private joke between them, now hung in the air like a verdict. Back inside the sudden quiet of the castle, the heavy doors thudded shut, muting the crowd's noise to a dull, persistent hum. The king clapped a hand on Ariel's shoulder. "A necessary day," Eleanor said, his voice low and earnest now, stripped of its public performance. "You have done well. You have saved us all." Ariel looked at her father, at the genuine relief in his eyes. He truly believed it. He could not see that in securing his kingdom's future, he had just extinguished his child's soul. Without a word, she pulled her arm from Catherine's light hold and walked away, down the corridor towards her rooms. Each step was an effort. The ceremonial cloak felt like a leaden weight, the coronet a band of fire around her temples. She needed to be free of the costume. She needed to breathe. But as she turned the corner, she found Charlotte waiting in an alcove, out of sight of the main hall. Her face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and a devastating heartbreak. Was it all a game? Charlotte's voice was a raw whisper, stripped of all formality. All those moments, was I just a fool serving a prince? The question hung between them, charged and terrible. The carefully constructed world of duty and deception had finally cracked, and through the fissure, all their pent-up anguish began to pour. The air in the alcove was cold, stagnant. Charlotte's question hung between them, a shard of glass poised to slice the last fragile thread holding Ariel's composure together. A game. Ariel's voice was a low, strained thing, the prince's register crumbling under the weight of the word. "You think that was a game?" She took a half-step forward, the movement causing her ceremonial cloak to brush against the stone wall with a whisper of finality. "Every moment with you has been the only thing in this entire farce that was real." Real. Charlotte's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound. "You are standing there in the robes of a prince, betrothed to a princess, and you speak to me of what is real? I was a distraction, a pastime for the crown until duty called." Her grey eyes glistened, not with tears, but with a fury born of profound hurt. "You could have told me. You could have trusted me with the truth of how hopeless it was." And what would that have changed? Ariel's hands clenched at her sides, the jewels on her fingers digging into her palms. Would it have made this easier? Knowing I was being forced into this transaction? My father believes this marriage is the only thing that will save our people from being wiped from the earth like Anet Nigra. How does my personal truth stand against that? It would have stood with me. Charlotte's whisper was fierce, her own control fracturing. I have stood by you since we were children hiding in the haylofts from your tutors. I have served you, protected you, and loved you. And you let me stand out there today and watch you accept your fate as if I were just another face in the crowd. As if what we are, what I thought we were, meant nothing. The word loved struck Ariel like a blow to the chest. It was the first time either of them had given voice to the feeling that had lived and grown in the silent spaces between them for years. It means everything, Ariel breathed, the confession tearing itself from her. It is the only thing that means anything. Can you not see? That is why I could not say it. To give it a name would be to make it real enough to be destroyed. And now, her gaze flickered towards the distant sound of the celebrating crowd. Now it is. The fight seemed to drain from Charlotte all at once, leaving behind a weary desolation. She looked at Ariel, truly looked at her, seeing not the prince in his finery, but the woman trapped within, equally as bound by the linen and the lies as she was by the ermine and jewels. What do we do? Charlotte asked, the question a surrender. I do not know, Ariel admitted, the truth a bitter pill. I am to be a wall against the storm. I cannot simply walk away. And I am to be the soldier who guards the wall. Charlotte's smile was a ghost of its former self. It seems our roles were written for us long before today. From the main hall, the sound of King Eleanor's voice called out, his tone sharp with impatience. Ariel, the Drunic delegation awaits. There is much to discuss. The moment shattered. The world of duty and doom rushed back in to fill the silence. Ariel took a step back, the distance between them widening into a chasm. The raw pain in Charlotte's eyes was replaced by the familiar, disciplined blankness of the night. Your Highness, Charlotte said, her voice flat once more. She gave a stiff, formal bow, the movement a final, brutal punctuation to their conversation. She turned and walked away, her boots echoing on the flagstones with a grim, steady rhythm that faded into the shadows of the corridor. Ariel stood alone in the alcove, the cold from the stone seeping through her cloak. She could still feel the ghost of Charlotte's anguish in the air, a colder chill than any stone could hold. She had thought the betrothal was the end of her life. She now understood it was far worse. It was a life sentence, and she had just been forced to shackle the one person who made that life worth living. Pushing away from the wall, she straightened her shoulders, the weight of the coronet once again a conscious pressure. The prince's mask settled back into place, a necessary armor against the pain. She had a part to play, a kingdom to placate, and a terrifying unseen enemy to prepare for. But beneath the silver-threaded tunic and the royal blue cloak, the woman named Ariel began to harden her heart into a weapon. The performance would continue, but the performer was no longer willing to be a passive player in her own destruction. The days that followed the betrothal announcement were a study in meticulous suffocation. Every moment of Ariel's life was now scheduled, observed, and politicized. Her mornings, once a sanctuary of solitary swordplay or stolen moments with Charlotte, were now consumed by strategy sessions with grim-faced generals and the Drunic advisors. Maps of the continent were spread across tables, with the void where Anet Nigra once stood serving as a chilling centerpiece. King Eleanor's presence was a constant, his hand heavy on the proceedings. The integration must be seamless, he would declare, jabbing a finger at the proposed troop movements. Saxon cavalry here, Drunic pikemen here. A combined force will present a unified front. King Aram would nod, his anxiety a palpable force in the room. The reports, they speak of no formations, no supply lines. How does one strategize against a wind? It was during one of these sessions that the first concrete report arrived. A breathless scout, his uniform stained with travel and terror, was ushered into the council chamber. He did not speak of armies, but of a silence. A forest, 3 days' ride east, where the birds no longer sang and the leaves had turned to a brittle crystalline substance that shattered at a touch. The air itself, he claimed, felt dead. A new kind of fear, cold and insidious, settled over the room. This was not the clash of swords they were prepared for. This was an unmaking. Through it all, Princess Catherine was a constant, quiet force. She sat beside Ariel, her attention unwavering, her questions to the generals sharp and insightful. She was building her wall, brick by bureaucratic brick. In private, she was cordial but distant, a fellow prisoner respecting the boundaries of their adjacent cells. She never mentioned the tension in the alcove, but a new understanding had settled in her eyes. She watched Ariel now with the analyst's cool curiosity, noting the way her gaze would stray to the window during long discussions, the subtle tightening of her jaw when referred to as son. One evening, after a particularly draining session on grain rationing, Ariel escaped to the battlements. The night air was a relief, a cold balm on her feverish thoughts. Below, the castle grounds were quiet, the hopeful banners from the betrothal now looking like forgotten decorations after a feast. She heard the familiar measured tread of a knight on patrol before she saw her. Charlotte rounded the corner of the parapet, her helmet on, her face hidden in shadow. She stopped at a respectful distance, her posture the very picture of professional duty. "Your Highness," she said, her voice muffled slightly by the helm. "The perimeter is secure." It was a standard report, but in the stillness of the night, it felt like an accusation. "Is it?" Ariel replied, her voice quiet. She turned from the view, leaning her back against the cold stone. "The scouts report today. It feels like no wall we build will matter." Charlotte was silent for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached up and removed her helmet, tucking it under her arm. The moonlight caught the sharp lines of her face, her expression unreadable. "A soldier's duty is to man the wall, regardless. It is all we can do." "Is it?" Ariel pushed, the frustration of the weeks boiling over. To stand and wait for a silent end? To follow orders that feel increasingly futile. What is the alternative? Charlotte's voice was low, but it carried an edge. To abandon our posts? To think only of ourselves? Her grey eyes locked with Ariel's. "You, of all people, are bound to that duty." The words were a shield, and Ariel knew what lay behind it, the raw hurt from the alcove, the betrayal of the betrothal. Their conversations were now a duel fought with double-edged words, each careful phrase capable of drawing blood. "There are different kinds of duty," Ariel said, holding her gaze. "And some of us are not free to choose which one we serve," Charlotte countered, her knuckles white where she gripped her helmet. The unspoken words hung between them. "You chose the crown. You did not choose me." Before Ariel could form a response, the sound of footsteps approached. Charlotte's mask snapped back into place. She gave a crisp bow. "The hour grows late, Your Highness. You should retire." She turned and continued her patrol, her figure dissolving into the darkness of the battlements, leaving Ariel alone with the chill and the crushing weight of what had been, and what could never be. The following afternoon, during a court reception for the Drunic nobles, the second close call occurred. Ariel was moving through the crowd, playing her part with a numb efficiency, when she passed too close to a suit of ornamental armor. A piece of the pauldron snagged on the delicate embroidery of her sleeve, pulling her up short. Before she could react, Charlotte was there. It was her duty, as part of the royal guard detail, to mitigate such inconveniences. Her hands, clad in leather gloves, came up to gently disentangle the fabric from the metal. Their proximity was sudden and overwhelming. Ariel could feel the warmth of Charlotte's body, smell the faint scent of oil and steel that always clung to her. Charlotte's head was bowed in concentration, her breath a soft whisper against Ariel's wrist. Her fingers worked deftly, but Ariel saw the slight tremor in them. The moment stretched, a bubble of tense intimacy in the bustling hall. Ariel's own breath hitched. She could have leaned forward, just an inch. She could have whispered her name. But then, the fabric came free. Charlotte's hands dropped as if burned. She took a swift step back, her eyes darting up to meet Ariel's for a fleeting electric second. In that glance was a universe of longing and regret. "My apologies, Your Highness," Charlotte said, her voice perfectly level, before melting back into the periphery of the room. Ariel stood frozen, the spot on her sleeve where Charlotte's fingers had been feeling seared into her skin. She looked up and found Catherine watching her from across the room, a glass of wine in her hand. Their eyes met. Catherine's expression was not one of anger or jealousy, but of dawning, cold comprehension. She had not seen a knight performing her duty. She had seen a lover's touch. Catherine offered a small knowing sip from her glass, her gaze lingering for a moment before she turned to engage a nearby lord. The trap, Ariel realized with a sinking heart, was not just around her. It was closing in on Charlotte too. And in that moment, the political maneuvering and the threat of the Vandras became a secondary fear. The more immediate danger was the truth, and the ruin it would bring upon the one person she truly cared for. The knowing glint in Catherine's eyes became a constant, unspoken accusation. In the days that followed, her demeanor towards Ariel shifted from distant partnership to something colder, more analytical. She did not confront her, she observed. During council meetings, Ariel could feel the princess's gaze noting the way she avoided using her official title, the subtle relaxation in her posture when discussions turned to martial strategy rather than courtly etiquette. The tension was a slow-burning fuse, and it found its spark in the royal library. Ariel had sought refuge among the towering shelves of parchment and leather, a desperate attempt to find a moment's peace from the performative rigors of the day. She ran a finger along the spine of a heavy tome, the lineage of Saxit, its contents a testament to the very bloodline that imprisoned her. "Seeking inspiration from your ancestors?" Ariel turned. Catherine stood at the end of the aisle, her form silhouetted by the soft light from a high window. She held a small leather-bound book in her own hands. "Merely seeking quiet," Ariel replied, her voice neutral. Catherine stepped forward, her movements quiet and deliberate. "It is a heavy crown you wear, even in here." She stopped a few feet away, her eyes not on Ariel, but on the book in her own hands. "I have been reading the accounts of Anat Nigra's fall. The last messages sent by their scrying stones. They spoke of the air turning to glass, of people pausing mid-action and then crumbling to dust." She finally looked up, and her gaze was not fearful, but brutally pragmatic. "It makes our little drama here feel rather insignificant, does it not?" "The personal and the political are not so easily separated," Ariel said, a defensive edge creeping into her tone. "Aren't they?" Catherine's smile was thin and humorless. "When the survival of two kingdoms is at stake, I would argue they must be." She took another step closer. The air in the aisle grew thick. "Your father believes this union will save us. My parents believe it. I have staked my life on it. And yet I cannot help but notice that your heart seems to be elsewhere stationed." Ariel's blood ran cold. She said nothing, holding Catherine's piercing stare. "The night," Catherine stated, the words not a question, but a final verdict. "Charlotte. It is her, isn't it?" The directness of it was a shock, stripping away the last pretense. Denial was pointless. The truth was laid bare between them in the dusty silence of the library. "What I feel for her is not a choice," Ariel said, the words a low, raw confession. "It is a fact." as fundamental as my own breath. And my presence here is a fact, Catherine countered, her voice dropping, losing its clinical edge and gaining a sliver of personal hurt. This alliance is a fact. The Vandras are a fact. She closed the distance, her voice a sharp whisper. I have read the oldest texts, Ariel. The ones only royal heirs are shown. The Vandras are not a natural plague. They are a cosmic one. They consumed the fruit of the Arthunal, a tree that was not a plant, but a nexus of reality itself. They stole the power of a universal cycle and then burned the source. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting 3 siblings who carry the ghost of a murdered god inside them, and they are bored. Her eyes were desperate now. Your feelings, however fundamental, do not change the arithmetic of our situation. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I enjoy knowing that the man I am to marry looks at his guard with more passion in a single glance than he has ever afforded me? We are both pawns in this, Ariel. The difference is, I am trying to play the game to save what remains of our world. You are trying to set the board on fire. I am trying to breathe. Ariel's composure shattered, her voice rising in a desperate hiss. For one moment, in a life that has been a lie since the day I was born, I am trying to hold on to the one thing that is true. The outburst echoed in the quiet space. Both women stood frozen, the truth finally, violently, out in the open. Catherine studied her, the anger in her eyes slowly giving way to a weary, devastating understanding. She saw not a defiant prince, but a trapped woman. The realization seemed to drain the fight from her. Then we are all lost, Catherine said, her voice flat and resigned. Because a wall built on a fracture cannot stand. And a ruler who leads with a broken heart leads their people to ruin. She looked down at the book in her hands, then back at Ariel, a profound sadness in her expression. My father was wrong. This will not save us. It will only break us faster. Without another word, Catherine turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing with a hollow finality. She did not look back. Ariel stood alone in the library, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on her. Catherine knew. The fragile, desperate alliance was fractured beyond repair. The political calculus had just become infinitely more complicated, and the personal stakes had skyrocketed. The walls of her gilded cage were not just closing in, they were beginning to crack, and through the fissures, she could see only chaos and ruin closing in on all of them, with Charlotte squarely in the path of the falling debris. The need to see her, to warn her, to simply be near her, was like an ache, a compulsion she could no longer deny. The confrontation in the library left Ariel feeling flayed, her raw nerves exposed to the cold castle air. Catherine's words were not a threat, but a prophecy. A wall built on a fracture cannot stand. The truth was now a third party in their arrangement, a silent judging presence in every council chamber and corridor. Driven by a desperate need for sanctuary, Ariel found herself moving through the castle's lower levels, towards the old armory. It was a place of practical solitude, smelling of metal polish, leather, and dust. Here the pretense of royalty felt thin, worn away by the grit of sharpening stones. She pushed the heavy door open and found Charlotte standing by a rack of practice swords, running a whetstone down a blade with a rhythmic, grating whisper. She did not look up, but her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. The air in the room, thick and still, suddenly felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. She knows, Ariel said, the words blunt and heavy, dropping into the quiet between them. The grating sound stopped. Charlotte's hands stilled. She slowly lowered the sword and the stone, placing them on a wooden bench with deliberate care before turning. Her face was a careful blank, but her eyes were wary, searching Ariel's for the shape of the disaster. The princess, Ariel clarified, her voice low. She knows it is you. Charlotte absorbed this without flinching. A long moment passed, filled only with the sound of their breathing. And And she believes it makes our alliance worthless. A fracture in the wall. Ariel took a step further into the room, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thud. She is not angry. She is resigned. She thinks we are all doomed. A humorless, brittle smile touched Charlotte's lips. Perhaps she is right. We train for a war against steel and flesh, and the enemy is a quiet wind that turns forests to crystal. We build a marriage for unity, and its foundation is a secret that shatters it from within. She shook her head, a gesture of profound exhaustion. We are fighting the tide with a sieve. Is that all we are doing? Ariel's voice was barely a whisper. She moved closer, until she could see the flecks of silver in Charlotte's gray eyes, the faint pulse at the base of her throat. The careful distance they had maintained since the betrothal now felt like a futile, self-inflicted torture. Fighting a tide? What else is there? Charlotte's question was a plea, a challenge. Her usual composure was fraying, the disciplined knight giving way to the heartbroken woman. You are bound. I am bound. The world is ending. What space is left for anything else? This, Ariel breathed. The space between them vanished. It was not a gentle meeting. It was a collision, a final, desperate surrender. Charlotte's hands came up, not to push away, but to grasp the front of Ariel's tunic, her knuckles white as she pulled her the remaining inch forward. Ariel's own hands found Charlotte's face, her fingers tangling in the loose strands of hair at her temples, cradling her as if she were something infinitely precious and about to be lost. The kiss was not soft. It was salt and desperation, a furious, aching press of lips that spoke of years of silence, of stolen glances, of a love that had grown in the shadows and was now demanding its moment in the doomed light. It tasted of Charlotte's tears and Ariel's own stifled sobs, a mingling of grief and a terrifying, defiant joy. It was the answer to every unspoken question, the culmination of every charged moment in the training yard, every brush of hands, every look held a second too long. It was the truth, finally, devastatingly, expressed. When they broke apart, they were both trembling, foreheads resting together, their breaths coming in ragged, shared gasps. The world outside, the Vandras, the kings, the politics, had ceased to exist. There was only this room, this silence, and the seismic shift that had just occurred between them. Charlotte's eyes were wide, the storm in them finally unleashed. Ariel, she whispered, the name a prayer and a confession on her lips. It was the first time she had ever called her by her true name. From the doorway, a soft, deliberate cough shattered the moment. They sprang apart, the spell broken. Standing in the doorway was not a guard, nor a servant. It was a figure they did not recognize, a tall, slender man dressed in the unassuming robes of a Drunic scribe. But his eyes were ancient, holding a cold, detached amusement that seemed to swallow the light in the room. He looked at them not with shock or disapproval, but with the casual interest of a patron observing a particularly engaging piece of theater. He offered a slow, faint smile, a gesture that never reached those chillingly old eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and melted back into the gloom of the corridor. A cold dread, deeper and more profound than any she had felt before, washed over Ariel. The intimate, world-altering truth of their kiss had been witnessed, and the observer had not been a mere mortal. The immediate danger was no longer Catherine's knowledge, or even her father's wrath. It was the bored, appraising gaze of the Vandras, and their game had just become infinitely more interesting. The air in the armory, once charged with the heat of their confession, turned to ice. The silence left in the scribe's wake was more terrifying than any shout. Charlotte's hand went to the hilt of her sword, a soldier's instinct, but the gesture was futile. They had not been caught by a man, they had been observed by a force of nature. Who was that? Charlotte whispered, her voice strained. Ariel could only shake her head, a cold certainty settling in her bones. Not a scribe. The man's eyes, lifetimes of eerie calm and detached amusement, were etched into her vision. One of them. It has to be. The realization was a different kind of binding. Their secret, their one sacred truth, was now known to the very entity that sought to erase their world. The personal and the apocalyptic had violently converged. They parted without another word, the urgency of the situation forcing them back into their roles. But the parting was different now. Charlotte's fingers briefly brushed against Ariel's wrist, a silent promise, a shared resolve, before she strode out, her face already hardening into the mask of the dutiful knight, though her eyes blazed with a new, fierce purpose. Ariel moved through the corridors like a ghost, the phantom pressure of Charlotte's lips still burning against her own. The encounter played in her mind, overlaid with the scribe's chilling smile. The Vandras were not just at the gates, they were inside, walking among them, studying their weaknesses. And she and Charlotte had just presented theirs on a platter. The news broke like a thunderclap later that evening. The Drunic delegation was in an uproar. Their esteemed scribe, a man named Kale, had vanished. He had left behind his robes, his materials, everything. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the air. King Aram was apoplectic, fearing abduction, a breach of security. But Ariel knew. He had gotten what he came for. A front-row seat to the crumbling human drama before the main event. The following days were a descent into a new tier of dread. The strange occurrences, once distant rumors, began to manifest closer to home. The castle's ancient central well, which had never run dry, began to yield water that was faintly sweet, unervingly warm, and left a shimmering crystalline residue in the buckets. The songbirds that nested in the eastern courtyards fell silent. The vibrant tapestries in the great hall seemed to bleed their colors, the dyes fading as if exposed to a century of sun in a single week. The world was not just being attacked, it was being unmade. During a council meeting where generals argued over phantoms and quartermasters reported on supplies that might turn to dust in their hands, Ariel found her father's gaze constantly drifting to her. It was heavier, more scrutinizing. Catherine, seated beside her, was a statue of quiet observation. She said nothing of the armory, but her silence was a louder accusation than any shout. When the council adjourned, Eleanor did not rise. "Ariel," he said, his voice low. "Remain." The room emptied, leaving father and child alone in the cavernous chamber. The king stood, pacing to the large map, his eyes fixed on the void that was Anat Nigra. "The Drunic king is nervous," Eleanor began, his back to her. "His daughter is unsettled. The alliance strains at the seams." He turned, and his eyes were flint. "And I hear whispers. Whispers of a knight who looks upon her prince with an unseemly familiarity." Ariel's heart stalled in her chest. "Father." "Do not," he cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. "I have spent a lifetime building your place in this world, forging you into the heir Sax it needs. I have ignored certain proclivities, attributing them to the spirit I needed you to project." He took a step closer, and for the first time, Ariel saw not a king, but a man terrified of losing his only grip on power. "But this ends now. This distraction, with the orphan girl. It ends." The word orphan was a deliberate blow, meant to underline Charlotte's expendability. "She is not a distraction," Ariel said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "She is whatever I say she is." Eleanor roared, his composure shattering. He slammed a fist onto the table, making the map jump. "The Vandras are at our door. Our only hope is a united front with Drunic, and you would jeopardize it all for a fleeting, what? Infatuation? Do you think your personal feelings matter when stacked against the survival of our entire people? You would sacrifice my soul to save your kingdom." Ariel shot back, rising to her feet, the prince's mask gone, leaving only the raw, wounded woman. "I would sacrifice 1,000 souls," he thundered. I would sacrifice my own. That is the burden of a crown you are too selfish to bear. He pointed a shaking finger at her. You will distance yourself from that girl. You will be a devoted fiancé to Catherine. You will be the prince I made you. Or I will remove the obstacle myself. The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. He would have Charlotte killed. Ariel looked at her father, at the man who had forced her into a life of deception and was now demanding she sever her only tether to reality. The fear she saw in his eyes was no longer for his people, but for his legacy. He was not building a wall against the Vandras. He was building a tomb, and he was determined to seal her inside it. You are a fool, Ariel said, her voice dangerously quiet. You are so afraid of the storm outside that you are tearing apart the only vessel that could possibly weather it. She turned and walked away, leaving the king standing alone in his council chamber. The fracture was no longer a hidden crack. It was a chasm, and she was standing on the wrong side of it, with the howling wind of the Vandras at her back and her father's wrath waiting before her. The performance was over. The war for her life, for Charlotte's life, had just begun. The silence in the council chamber echoed long after the heavy door thudded shut behind Ariel. Her footsteps did not carry the measured grace of a prince, but the sharp, furious strike of a prisoner testing her chains. Her father's threat, I will remove the obstacle myself, was a brand seared into her mind, a clear and present danger far more tangible than the vague horror of the Vandras. She could not return to her rooms. The opulent space felt like a gilded cell, its walls inscribed with the expectations she was now ready to shatter. Instead, she moved with a desperate purpose towards the oldest part of the castle, the foundations laid when Saxet was a mere fortress. She needed the one person who was both her sanctuary and her strength. She found Charlotte not in the knight's quarters, but in the relic of the old scriptorium, a small circular room where ancient treaties were once copied. It was a place of forgotten history, a fitting rendezvous for their forbidden truth. Moonlight filtered through a high, narrow window, painting a silver stripe across the stone floor. Charlotte stood in that stripe of light, waiting. She had not been summoned, but she had known Ariel would come. The confrontation with the king was a tremor they had both felt. He threatened you, Ariel said, the words raw. It was not a question. Charlotte's expression was grim, but devoid of surprise. It was always a possibility. I am a commodity to him, one that has become defective. She stepped forward, her gaze searching Ariel's face. What will you do? The question hung between them. For years, the answer had been obedience, duty, a slow self-annihilation. But the taste of Charlotte's lips, the feel of her hands, had made that path untenable. The king's threat had made it suicidal. I will not let him harm you, Ariel vowed, her voice low and fierce. I will not be the instrument of your destruction. I have spent my life playing a part to preserve a legacy that now seeks to destroy the only thing I value. She reached out, her fingers brushing Charlotte's. The alliance is ash. Catherine knows. My father sees me as a traitor. There is nothing left for me to save here. Charlotte intertwined their fingers, her grip firm, an anchor in the raging storm. Then we run. The words, once unthinkable, now felt like the only sane option. Where? The Vandras are everywhere. Then we find a corner of everywhere, and we take it for ourselves, Charlotte said, her soldier's pragmatism forging a desperate plan. For a day. An hour. It would be more than we were ever promised. The decision, once spoken, became reality. They would not wait for the executioner's axe, either from the king or the Vandras. They would steal what time they could. The plan was born in frantic whispers. They would use the chaos of the impending crisis, the strange occurrences that had the castle guard on edge and looking outward. Charlotte knew the watch rotations, the blind spots in the patrols. Ariel knew the castle's secret passages, the forgotten routes built by paranoid ancestors. They chose their sanctuary not for comfort, but for obscurity, a disused chamber deep within the citadel's thickest wall, once a listening post for long-dead spymasters. It was accessible only through a hidden door disguised as part of the stonework in a storage cellar. The escape was a nerve-shredding ballet. Ariel, shedding her princely doublet for a dark, simple tunic and trousers from her own neglected wardrobe, felt a terrifying, giddy sense of shedding her own skin. She moved like a ghost through the secret corridors, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every distant footfall, every echo of a voice, was a potential doom. Charlotte, having created an alibi by swapping a patrol duty, met her at the cellar entrance. Their eyes met in the profound darkness, a shared look of terror and exhilaration. With a soft click, the hidden door swung inward, revealing a space no larger than a prison cell, containing only a stone bench and a sliver of a window looking out onto a confined courtyard. The door sealed behind them, muting the world to a distant hum. They were alone. Truly, utterly alone for the first time. For a long moment, they just stood in the dimness, breathing the dusty, still air, their hands still clasped as if letting go would break the spell. Then, Charlotte reached out. Her fingers went not to Ariel's face, but to the linen binding still constricting her chest. It was a question in the silence. Ariel gave a single, slow nod. With a tenderness that made Ariel's throat tighten, Charlotte's hands worked at the knots she herself had tied that morning. The first loop loosened. Then the second. With each released layer, a weight Ariel had carried for a lifetime seemed to lift. The final strip fell away. Ariel drew a deep, shuddering breath, her lungs expanding fully, freely, for the first time since dawn. It was more than a release, it was an unbinding of her very spirit. In the faint light, she saw Charlotte's eyes, wide with a reverence that was more intimate than any kiss. "Ariel," Charlotte whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Hearing her name, her true name, spoken with such love in this hidden space, broke the last of her resolve. A sob escaped her, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming liberation. Charlotte's arms encircled her, pulling her close, holding her as she trembled. They sank onto the stone bench, the world outside forgotten. There, in the profound quiet, they explored the cartography of each other. There was no urgency born of doom, but a slow, deliberate reverence. It was a conversation of touch, a silent language of hands and lips that spoke of years of longing, of stolen glances finally made real. Charlotte traced the faint, permanent lines the bindings had left on Ariel's skin, her touch a balm. Ariel, in turn, mapped the scars on Charlotte's hands and arms, the story of her hard-won skill, the testament of her survival. They were not a prince and a knight here. They were simply two women, stripped of all artifice, finding a home in each other. Later, they lay together on a spread-out cloak, the night deep around them. Through the slit of a window, they could see a square of sky, the stars blotted out by a peculiar shimmering haze. "They are closer," Charlotte murmured, her head on Ariel's shoulder. Ariel tightened her hold. "I know." But the terror of the Vandras, the threat of her father, even the ghost of Catherine's resigned prophecy, it all felt distant, held at bay by the fragile, impossible fortress of their joined bodies. They had chosen each other over kingdoms, over duty, over survival itself. They had stolen this night from the jaws of the end, and for now, in the silent, dusty dark, it was enough. It was everything. Dawn did not come with light, but with a slow, sickly brightening. The strange haze that had occluded the stars congealed into a pearlescent, shimmering dome that seemed to press down upon the castle, muting all sound. The air grew thick, heavy to breathe, and carried a faint metallic tang. From their sanctuary, Ariel and Charlotte heard the first screams, not of battle, but of pure, uncomprehending terror. The Vandras were no longer at the gates. They were in the air, in the stone, in the very substance of reality. They dressed in silence, their movements slow, deliberate. There was no panic. The frantic energy of their escape had burned away, leaving behind a profound, chilling calm. Ariel did not reach for the bindings. She pulled the dark tunic over her head, the fabric resting against her skin without the familiar pressure. It was a final, quiet declaration. Charlotte buckled her sword belt, the gesture automatic, though the weapon was as useless as a twig against what was coming. Her eyes met Ariel's, and a whole conversation passed between them in that look. There would be no heroic last stand. There was no wall to man. Their duty was to each other, now and for whatever moments remained. The hidden door groaned as they pushed it open. The cellar beyond was chaos. Dust rained from the ceiling. A barrel of salt pork had split open, its contents now a fine gray powder. The world was not being destroyed, it was being disassembled. They moved through the lower corridors, a journey through a waking nightmare. They saw a guardsman frozen mid-stride, his form gradually translucifying, the pattern of the tapestry behind him beginning to show through his flesh. They heard the frantic, disjointed shouts of captains trying to rally troops that were simply ceasing to exist. The stone walls themselves seemed to be losing their cohesion, their edges blurring, their color leaching away into a uniform, silent gray. They did not run toward the fight. There was no fight. They retreated, instead, back to the only place that had ever been theirs. Back to the sanctuary. As they reached the cellar entrance, the floor lurched. A great, grinding roar echoed from the heart of the castle, the sound of a mountain dying. The king's seat, the throne room, the council chamber, it was all coming down, not in rubble, but into nothingness. They stumbled into their hidden room and barred the door. It was a futile gesture, but it was a choice. They would meet the end on their own terms. The little chamber trembled around them. The sliver of window now showed not a courtyard, but a swirling, formless void of muted colors and silent energy. The Vandras were not attacking the kingdom, they were erasing its canvas. Charlotte turned from the window, her face pale but serene. She reached for Ariel, her hands finding hers. Their fingers laced together, an anchor in the dissolving world. "It seems Catherine was right," Ariel said, her voice remarkably steady. "The wall could not stand." "It was never meant to," Charlotte replied. She drew Ariel to the stone bench, pulling her close, tucking Ariel's head against her shoulder. Ariel's arms wrapped around her waist, holding on as the very air began to hum with a terrifying final frequency. The stones around them began to whisper, their solid form unraveling into threads of pale light. The world was becoming a sketch, then a memory, then a blank page. "Look at me," Charlotte whispered, her voice the only solid thing left in the universe. "Just look at me." Ariel leaned back, her vision blurring not with tears, but with the fading of the light. She looked into Charlotte's eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. She saw no fear there. Only love. A love that had been more real than any crown or kingdom. A smile touched Ariel's lips, a true, unburdened smile, the first of her life and the last. It held no regret, only a perfect, devastating peace. "My Charlotte," she said. Charlotte's own smile was a small, brave thing. She leaned her forehead against Ariel's. "My Ariel." The humming rose to a silent, piercing note. The last stone, the last mote of dust, the last breath of air dissolved into a great, gentle quiet. The sanctuary, the castle, the kingdom, the world, all of it was gone. And in the end, there was no sound, no light, no dark. There was only the love, holding fast in the infinite, final stillness. There was no pain, no tearing, no fire, no fall. It was not an ending that could be felt by the body, for the body was no more. It was an unraveling, a gentle coming apart at the seams of existence. The love did not hold fast as a thing separate from the stillness. It became the stillness. Where the Saxon kingdom once stood, there was now a plain of smoothed, featureless stone, warm to the touch and humming with a residual, impossible energy. The air was perfectly clear, perfectly silent. The Vandras had moved on, their purpose fulfilled. The garden had been burned clean. In the center of this new blank expanse, 3 figures stood. They were the siblings, their forms shimmering with the placid light of a task completed. There was no triumph on their faces, only the quiet satisfaction of artists stepping back from a finished canvas. The eldest, who had worn the face of the scribe Kale, tilted his head as if listening to a distant sound. The structural integrity of the timeline in this sector has been compromised by 99.8%, he stated, his voice devoid of anything but calm observation. The reset is proceeding within acceptable parameters. The second, a woman with eyes like deep water, nodded slowly. The energy signature of the Arthunal's dissolution continues to stabilize the local reality. As predicted. The third, younger in appearance but equally ancient, was looking at the spot where the castle's heart had been. Not at the stone, but at the memory imprinted upon the nothingness. A curious resonance lingered there, they murmured, a faint flicker of something akin to interest in their gaze. At the epicenter. A defiance not of us, but of the inherent meaninglessness. The eldest followed their gaze. The 2 mortals. Their terminal cognitive patterns intertwined at the moment of dissolution. A futile gesture. Was it? The younger one countered softly. They achieved a coherence the rest of this civilization failed to grasp. They understood the assignment of their own hearts, even as the world's page was being turned. A long silence passed between them, a conversation of millennia happening in a glance. The substrate is prepared, the woman said, her tone final. The next cycle may yield more interesting patterns. The 3 figures turned in unison. There was no flash of light, no sound. They simply were, and then they were not. The plane of stone remained. The silence remained. But in the absolute quiet, if one could have listened with a soul instead of ears, there might have been a faint, enduring echo. Not a sound, but the ghost of a feeling, the shape of 2 figures, forever holding one another, their love the last note of a song that had ended, and the first atom of a world yet to be born. Their story was over. But in its ending, it had carved a small permanent truth into the face of oblivion itself.